It's 3 years. It's been crazy 3 years. Oh, well, thanks for yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Pratt. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much. Oh, oh yeah. We have to share the stage with the football game apparently, which I'm not. So we have everyone that's going to speak. We already have them here, but we're going to start with opening remarks from you, and then we're going to go to the panel discussion with funders and youth organizations. We have we have someone talking from the GEF, from Paula. Paula is speaking from the GEF, and then we have a few private funders. So we have Synchronicity Earth, we have the Wild Foundation, we have One Earth, and we have Grounded. So it's a lot of private funders that are going to speak, and it's about how funders can shift towards funding more youth-led initiatives and more youth-led work. Will that work? Yeah, of course. I'll I'll start in about 2 minutes just with a land acknowledgement, and I'll hand over. I'll introduce you right away afterwards, and then hand over to you if that's okay.
Hi, how you doing? Right, yeah. So how are things going so far?
Here, there's a lot of excitement.
Hi. Yes, I am. Oh, Verona. Very nice to meet you. We just met. Thank you. Think we'll. Hey, Melina, how are you? Good. I think so. We'll find out. Could I check something with you? Do you know if Neil? You know, I can check with Neil as well. Is he still heading the Secretariat's division for mainstreaming, partnerships, and outreach? Okay, perfect. Thank you. I didn't want to say anything wrong. All right. All right. Sit wherever you want to sit. Oh, I need to sit down.
So where do you want me?
If you want to, you can. Yeah, you can come sit next to me if that's all right. I think they should all be turned on already, so you don't. Yeah, you know the space much better than me, of course. Can just. I think we can start. Otherwise, we'll run over. Yes. Yeah, of course. There's drinks and coffee and everything on the side there.
So after I've said remarks, I go off stage because you're bringing some panelists up. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yes. Is that? If yeah.
Yeah.
And then yeah, we can. You can join. I mean, it'd be wonderful to have you here, but also I can imagine you have a very busy schedule.
Yeah.
So, up to you.
Paola, are you really? Okay, yeah, we've never met or communicated. We're starting now.
All right. Yeah. I'll call you up afterwards. Sorry. No, no. Hello, everyone. Can nice. I can be heard. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your, what I imagine is a very busy time for everyone here. Welcome. There's still some free seats. Do please fill them. Just very brief introduction to myself. Hi. My name is Felix Feider. I'm a program officer at Synchronicity Earth. charity based in the UK, focused on supporting overlooked and underfunded conservation issues around the world. I'll be a moderator for today. Before we start the discussion today, I just want to recognize that COP15 is taking place on unceded indigenous lands. The Ganyen-Gehaga nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and the waters on which we gather today. Jojage, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for First Nations, and today it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We strive around the world to support the authority and capacity of indigenous peoples to steward the lands and waters, which is critical for the future of healthy ecosystems and communities. I'm really looking for the discussion that we're going to have today, and we're very lucky to have Mr. Neil Pratt with us today. He's a Senior Environmental Affairs Officer at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, heading the Secretariat's Division for Mainstreaming, Partnerships and Outreach. Thank you very much, Mr. Pratt, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Yeah. Is this working now? Or
Is it, what if we press this button here? Oh, it's not working. Oh. Oh, no.
Yeah, that's working. Thanks very much, and thank you very much for that very respectful welcoming and acknowledging the territories in which we are gathered. I'd like to sincerely thank our friends at the Global Environment Facility for hosting this event, involved and organized by the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, that over the years has become a very important constituency in the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in that respect, not just following the processes of the CBD and contributing to the discussions and the development of policy under the Convention, but also acting as a bridge between the development and adoption of policy and action and implementation on the ground. And that kind of action needs two or three things. Firstly, it needs commitment and enthusiasm of the actors, of groups, individuals, organizations on the ground who can give a great deal, as they do through personal investment in joining us in meetings such as this, to practical actions on the ground. But it also requires certain elements of the means of implementation. And I think one of the objectives with this session and this meeting is to think about and discuss appropriate ways of channeling support to youth-based organizations for action on the ground. And that can be quite challenging because in many cases, such organizations, such groups are not set up in the traditional manners that we're used to, for example, in the United Nations system, in terms of the development of projects, the processing of these, and the channeling of resources. So this is a real challenge to many groups, including young people, including indigenous peoples and local communities. But it is a challenge that the GEF is looking to address. And I think there are a number of interesting and practical developments over the years. The Small Grants Program, for example, has always acted as a a lighter model to work with community groups who are not so set up for the larger, more complex project cycle management structures. And I believe even under the recently concluded and the new 8th replenishment of the Global Environment Facility, there are a number of elements of specific attention that can apply to young people and have already been trialed and tested with respect to indigenous peoples and local communities through the previous cycle. So I hope that, for example, that's one of the channels that we'll be able to discuss in this session. And I understand from our hosts that we've got with us as well representatives from a few foundations that might well be better set up than certain traditional donors to work with young people and activists. At the CBD Secretariat, we just taking the Global Youth Biodiversity Network as our focus, perhaps in this session. We've developed a strong relationship and working through our own quite cumbersome UN processes, have been able to provide support over the years to help grow this network. But even we certainly do have challenges with that. So, for example, unlike the financing models we have that can enable the financial support to representatives of parties to the convention, and also we have a special fund aimed at indigenous peoples. We don't have such a structure that can be utilized for regular stakeholders, including youth. And certain restrictions in the UN processes, such as our procurement rules, make it very difficult for us to serve as a channel for donors through to the network. So that's just an example of some of the challenges that we've had, and I imagine we'll hear more from Gibbon on that. But I think this could be a really helpful discussion this afternoon on ways and means that collectively we can find solutions that will enable us to nurture and enable the genuine commitment and action that can be brought by young people on the ground. So with that, thank you very much, and I hand back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Pratt. I just wanted to say thanks a lot. I think a lot of the points that you already mentioned are some of the points we were hoping to get to in the discussion today. So thank you for this fantastic introduction. And thank you for all the support that the CBD Secretariat has provided youth already over the last few years. And I couldn't agree more. The work that Gibbon has been doing in working to engage young people in these processes is absolutely fantastic. And the funder community should recognize that and also work towards supporting that more and more. Thank you very much. We have quite a few people that are going to tell us a little bit about their perspectives, the challenges, but also some of the solutions some of them have been working on today. So we're going to have a few separate discussions, somewhat connected as well. I'm really happy to be calling onto the stage Archana Soreng. She is one of the UN Secretary General's youth advisors on climate change, works as a research officer with Vasundhara Odisha, an action research and policy advocacy organization working on the rights of indigenous peoples, biodiversity conservation, sustainable livelihoods and climate action in India, and also very engaged with the newly formed Youth Climate Justice Fund. Thank you so much for joining us today, Archana. From the funder community, I'm also really excited to call Jessica Sweidan to the stage. Jessica has been an active philanthropist for the last 20 years. She is the co-founder and trustee of Synchronicity Earth, my organization as well, funding overlooked and underfunded conservation issues globally, and also more recently co-founded the Flourishing Diversity platform. Thank you so much for joining this panel. If it's okay with you, I'll start with the first question. I'd be really curious to hear from you, Archana. What do you see as, why does it seem so challenging for youth-led organizations and youth to access funding, and what do you want from funders?
Johar everyone, and I'm so grateful to be here as Global Youth Biodiversity Network, and emphasizing on the need of finance and support allocation for young people. I think one thing which is really crucial, as member of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, we had undertaken a study in terms of how much of fund allocation is going to young people engaged in climate spaces. And as a result of study, we found that only 0.76% of the climate philanthropy goes to youth climate movements. And that's so sad that now at this point of time when we talk about youth movement, this is just the bleak. And the most saddest part is this, from this percentage, most of the funding again goes to the global north and not to the global south. And that's why I feel when we talk about what are the challenges which we are facing in the climate discourse, biodiversity discourse, more so for the young people in an intersectional approach, is about lack of funding allocation made to the young people. I think it's very important to also speak about the need of trust and belief and solidarity amongst each one of us. I think there needs to be more trust, more respect, and more solidarity amongst different stakeholders, and especially for young people. We have been engaging in all the spaces as per our different expertise, thematics, and advocating in our different capacities. It's important for the climate finance, philanthropists, and funding spaces to allocate fund to the young people. It's also really important to emphasize about the need of flexibility, like flexibility in terms of accessing funding, and flexibility also what needs to be done after accessing funding. Because one thing is really critical is to see that often young people, indigenous people, local communities from the grassroots are not being able to access these funding resources because of limited restriction, loss of and lack of access because of languages and different informations being available to you, available to them. And it's mostly from an approach that they should know about us. But it's also important to see, are we making efforts for them to know about us? The fundings being available. And the second thing, when we talk about access and flexibility in the processes, it's also important to know that how these processes are more in terms of decided by them. They are in the processes of making what are the work they want to engage in, what are the processes they want to engage in, because it should not be again prescriptive, like they should be doing this and that's why we do fund allocation. Rather, it should be how it is enabling and enhancing, and more so in a holistic approach which is accessible to the indigenous people, local communities, and young people. So I think when we talk about challenges, it's more so about building trust amongst each other, and also allocation of funding more so in terms of accessibility.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Archana, for those points. I think very, very poignant remarks, especially the point that you highlighted towards the end again, this key role of trust in what we hope are going to be more and more youth-led funding relationships. Jessica is a funder with a few years of experience. What's your reaction to when you hear about these challenges?
the youth are not only the future, you guys are leading the movements. So from my point of view, I feel like my role as a funder is to adapt and learn as fast as I possibly can by what your needs are, where you're moving into, how you're doing the work that you're doing, and how we can then support you in a much more fluid, dynamic way. I think that for me, the fluidity piece is really interesting from a traditional funding point of view, and it's something that we've really tried to overcome and embed within the work that we do at Synchronicity Earth in terms of how can we, how can we as a funder manage the lion's share of the complexity of getting funding to the ground, whether it's Indigenous communities, local communities, or youth. We champion so many youth-led initiatives across our programs, whether it's in the Congo Basin freshwater biodiversity work, our species programs. We know that we have a lot of youth-led, we have a lot of leaders that are young people within all of the programs and projects that we support. It's something that we're actually actively identifying and looking for and, improving upon constantly. So for me, it's really about, and using my platform, whatever that is, as a funder, but as a IUCN patron of nature, as somebody who's really working very distinctly within the kind of biocultural space, to start to shout about this, to start to really bring in more people and to try to diffuse the complexity of getting funding to the different youth movements. Traditional funders aren't really set up to be dynamic in their funding. They create a lot of complex framing devices, and I've spent since I met you at COP26 in Glasgow, you guys fired me up, and then all of a sudden I found myself talking to all of the different youth groups. We had already met Gibbon by that point, but I just was trying to understand the matrix of all of the different youth organizations that were working and how they were complementing each other or not, and what that looked like, what was the web, and how could we support and intervene where it made sense, and also then I'll get out of the way where it made sense. And some of the mentoring that I've sort of done just personally, beyond the role and scope of what we're doing with Synchronicity Earth, is to try to help diffuse some of the complexities around funding structures, or how do you talk to a philanthropist, or what philanthropist should I be speaking to? Do you know what kind of money I should be raising in this instance? And thinking about the actual functional structures of getting funding into the spaces and places that it's needed. So for me, it's just about, if you've got the will, we've got you guys have the courage and the will. We just need to support you. We just need to get better at figuring out and making our systems far easier to get funding to you in a much simpler format.
Thanks. I think something a lot of people could agree with. I'm wondering, Archana, we talked a little bit about trends that we see within the funders, within the funder community. Are there any trends that give you hope that we're moving in the right direction, or do you see some people moving in the wrong direction as well?
I think if we see past couple of years, I think we have come a long way. Like we have been working with a initiative called Youth Climate Justice Fund, and in this journey I feel, as I said about trust, respect and solidarity, we have met amazing people, and one of is Jessica, is that people are starting to believe in young people, and people are also emphasizing and slowly gradually advocating for fund allocation for young people. And before I move on to like the funders believing, I would also like to say that we as young people from different youth constituencies, different thematics are coming together, because lack of fund allocation is in every space, like whether it is in climate, whether it is in biodiversity, whether it is desertification or other constituencies of young people, it is there. And now we are coming across together because all of the issues, whether it is climate, biodiversity, it is intersectional. We are talking about biodiversity loss, we are talking about impacts of climate crisis, and most importantly, the young people, the indigenous people, local communities, marginalized communities are all affected by all of these issues together. And most importantly, in a regularly back to back or constantly without any support. So I think it's really important to come with these kind of initiative, and one of the objective of this initiative of ours was this: there is barely any youth led financial allocation which is happening, more so in a leadership of young people. And we need that from a lens of young people, because it's us young people who have been engaging in our spaces, we have been knowing our issues, and more so being aware with the networks and groups and associations in ground. So I think it's really important for us young people, and through Youth Climate Justice Fund we aim to access these resources for the young people, and more so also engage young people where we are being able to reach out to the young people, those who need the most across the regions. And the second thing, in the question of hope, I feel in this entire journey we have met a lot of philanthropists and funding agencies, and in the discourse of climate finance also, where there is will and the allocation is starting to come. I think, as Jessica said, there's also information not there amongst people. Like for me, like how do I reach out to funding agency and how do I receive support, and also from them, like how and who needs their support. So that bridge, the dialogue is also not happening. So I think we also need to make sure that we are engaging in spaces for dialogue, where again comes across like this side event then plays a really important role in having that dialogue. So I think when we are talking about hope, it's also important to have this conversation and have people and stakeholders on board, because that is also one of the very critical act which we barely do have in spaces. Because there's also like uh, lack of trust, there's also sometimes threat, is like, how do these stakeholders will come together, and will they be able to have a dialogue together. So I think what is important for us is that the urgency of the issues is so critical at this moment, whether we talk about biodiversity loss or climate crisis. We all need to come together, and where slowly we are trying to come together, but a lot more needs to be done. A lot more needs to be done, and our youth-led climate justice fund is just an iota in that entire engagement and ecosystem, and we believe we can make difference, but we need more of you all to champion for fund allocation for young people in all the spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archana. Really like that point, that we need to have more of these dialogues, and I think within the hour that we have today we can start scratching at the surface, but we'll need to continue this dialogue and take more time for this as well. We will have this space for 30 minutes after this discussion as well, so we can stay around and have some more discussions once the event is done. There's also drinks to accompany us. I'd like to thank you both very, very much for coming onto the panel, and looking forward to continuing the conversation off stage afterwards. Thank you very much. You can just leave it like that, yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, I'm very excited to move on to our next discussion today. I'm really looking forward to welcoming Kevin Lunzalu to the stage. Kevin is a young ecologist, researcher, and ocean campaigner from Kenya. And he's also the co-founder of the Kenyan Youth Biodiversity Network, and he's also a steering committee member of CoalitionWILD. Thank you very much for joining us today, Kevin. And then, really looking forward as well to welcoming Paola Rudolfi, manager and ad interim director of the Policy and Partnership Unit at the Global Environment Facility, who very generously are providing us the space today to have this dialogue. Thank you very much for joining, Paula. Well, I'd be really curious to also hear your takes on these questions. Kevin, from your perspective, and you have loads of experience in this as well, what do you see? Why is it so challenging for youth organizations to access funding? What do you see as the main challenges from your experiences, and what do you want funders to know and do differently, maybe?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So, apart from the challenges that have already been mentioned with the general availability of funding that goes to biodiversity and the bureaucratic processes that are around it, there is also the challenge of the sustainability of funding that goes to youth-led initiatives. There is this idea of giving small short-term grants to young people and expecting long-term sustainable impact. So I think it's time we realize that biodiversity issues that young people across the world are working on are equally complex, whether it is climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And they equally require long-term sustainable funding. So the funders, the traditional funders so far, have been ready to give long-term funding to well-established organizations. But when it comes to young people, it's usually short-term grants. And I think one of the challenges that was pointed towards that is that youth organizations or youth initiatives are not as well structured as those international organizations. But I don't see that as a challenge. I see that as an opportunity to build the capacity of these youth organizations so that they are also ready and capable to not just receive the long-term sustainable funding, but equally effectively utilize the funding and report back on the impact that it creates. So we expect funders to understand that youth initiative can also be financed in the long term, and they can be equally effective. And on bureaucracy, I would just like to mention one thing, that international funding, especially that's flowing to the global south, there are so many restrictions that are currently attached to such funding. You know, youth organizations are expected to, for example, have several years of audited accounts, have like the 50% of the funding to match some of the funding requirements and stuff like that, or have an established organization that will receive the funding on their behalf. But these established organizations mostly receive a percentage of the money for administrative purposes. And this drastically reduces the budgets that the final amounts that gets to the young people. So we need to work on such restrictions and make the funding fluid to be accessed by young people at the lowest grassroots level.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you so much for making those points. I think all very funders need to hear those concerns and those ideas to basically improve funding, but then also improve the longevity of youth-led work. So I know the GEF is doing lots of work to support smaller community-led and locally led and youth-led organizations as well. So from your perspective and your many years of experience, what do you see as what needs to change from the funder's perspective? What needs to change within funders' processes to make it to make funding more accessible to youth-led organizations to overcome some of these challenges that Archana and Kevin have highlighted?
Thank you, Felix. And I totally agree. Kevin identified the real constraints, and even before all the issues that he mentioned, there is the problem of registering as CSOs recognized, which in some countries is really problematic. The Global Environment Facility has been around since 1992, so for a very long time, and it is now getting really closer to the importance of social inclusion, which is a main, one of the main new innovation that we have in the Global Environment Facility replenishment cycle that you mentioned earlier has started a few months ago and will take us through the next 4 years. And as part of this social inclusion trend, we are going to see 3 main initiatives. One is a new CSO challenge program that will allocate $10 million for each of 2 CSO challenge programs focusing on microfinance and on youth that are part of the small grants program that has been around for many, many years. We have decided to really open up part of the small grants program facility to the youth, because we recognize precisely the challenges that Kevin has identified, and that, as Archana said earlier, are a real constraint and end up really benefiting only the global north youth rather than global south. So these SGP facilities are going to start very soon. There will be a call for proposal for youth in 144 countries where the SGP is present, and organizations will be able to compete for these funds with proposing initiatives that involve the youth. Now, we're also looking at researchers in the global south, young researchers. So we're launching a new fund for young researchers in memory of our dear colleague, esteemed scientist and GEF official who unfortunately left us a few months ago. The Gustavo Fonseca Youth Leadership Program is being launched, and that's also for $10 million. And it will benefit researchers globally from the global south only. We're also looking at financing the youth through a GEF Challenge program that will be launched at the end of August in Vancouver at the GEF Assembly. We're coming back to Canada, who is our host for the GEF Assembly. It's a co-host together with the First Nations of Canada that were remembered earlier by Neil and that are our host here as well. So we're going to have this challenge program launched in Vancouver at the end of August at the GEF Assembly, and we hope to see you there. But let me just challenge a little bit beyond sort of the financing facilities that are coming through the GEF that we're happy to initiate as part of our GEF inclusion new initiatives that we're launching. I want to really highlight what I found in Synchronicity Earth to be really an innovative way of looking at things. In your website, I was very pleased to find monitoring and evaluation and knowledge learning, as I can see that somebody whose picture is in the website is right here. I'm happy to meet you in person. As part of your way of doing business. So looking at how the youth helps mainstream innovate through piloting of initiatives and gathering lessons learned and monitoring how these lessons are gathered is really the way to build knowledge on biodiversity and conservation from the ground up. And when I look at the negotiations that are happening right now, and I compare those to the climate negotiation, I don't see the monitoring steps that are needed to really bind countries to a set of intermediate goals. And why not linking up your experiences as youth organization and provide those intermediate steps, the monitoring steps that are realistic and achievable, to then be to really have those reflected in the high-level negotiations. And that's really the role that I see for the youth organizations, to really inform the dialogue at the negotiations level with realistic steps that you live every day and you can attest to are actually implementable. So when you come in with ideas and data, those can actually inform the dialogue and the negotiations. And that's really, I think, the role beyond sort of being part of the financing environment. Of course, you need resources to do that. But that's really the role that I see And I'm very grateful to Synchronicity Earth for playing that role, which is also a very important one that we see at the GEF. And moving forward, the way we're seeing the engagement with the youth is also as executing agencies, executing partners of GEF projects. So in addition to the SGP, which is a small grants program with 2 new facilities for CSOs, including one dedicated to the youth, also partnering with the youth and CSO organizations to execute projects on the ground, working with our 18 implementing agencies that receive funding from the GEF to actually be the ones who carry out the activities in partnership with GEF implementing agencies. A real active role, I think, is the ultimate objective that we see for youth organizations, and we look forward to seeing more of you in the coming months as we engage in new initiatives. But thank you for having us, and thank you, Kevin, and thank you, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola. I think you made so many incredible points, but just picking up on the last one that you mentioned, the role of young people in really implementing these projects. We're not just like youth aren't just standby participants. I think they're absolutely key to the implementation of whatever the global biodiversity framework will be. Youth are going to be key to make sure that this is implemented in an equitable and effective manner. And they need that support. So going back to this long-term support that you mentioned previously, the flexibility of the support that is so crucial. So I hope we can work together in moving further towards that direction. And it's fantastic to hear that the GEF has all of these plans to really focus more and more support on youth and their efforts. So thank you very much. I'd like to maybe just Kevin, we already have to wrap up quickly, but soon. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe, what are your reflections of what Paola just heard? Any follow-up questions you have on that, or any reflections? Anything that really stood out to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paola, for sharing the opportunities that are there for young people to engage. And especially the funding that's going to be flowing to the Global South to support youth initiative. I really like your point on monitoring and evaluation, and young people being on the forefront of informing negotiations around the practicability of funding flowing to the grassroots where it's needed. But this is for the funding that's coming. My question to you is, GEF and other funders already have money that they have over the years been giving to their partners. And we know that a lot of this money is already going into what I call the big organizations, the bingos. So how do young people get a share of this money? How do we, apart from just informing the policies and informing the money that's coming, how do we convince the current funders to reconstitute their funding models so that they consider grassroots local initiatives as equally effective and viable for such funding?
Thank you, Kevin. That's a very difficult question. So it's a question of basically trust, as Archana was saying earlier, right? And how do you measure trust, and how do you make sure that you're actually a trusted partner? And I think if you look at the parallel with the climate youth organizations, which you're also part of, it's really about the advocacy and being the voice. And when you are an advocate and you are a voice and you are a credible voice, people have to listen. And I think we need to really do with biodiversity the same thing that has happened with the climate movement, which is to really connect with that and show that there is only one voice, and it's about nature. It is not just about climate and biodiversity separately. And it's the same youth movement that brings that voice to the forefront and can be trusted because they have roots on the ground and they speak for the future who's inheriting this this planet. So I think it's really about trust. It is really about being part of executing, being part of the action where the projects happen, also pointing when things don't work, being the voice, being close to where the funding is, even from outside, if you're not involved, but still being the advocate for trust on the ground and pointing when things go wrong, letting us know the project is not reaching the results, we don't see impact. You need to listen to us as actors on the ground for monitoring and evaluating impact. I think you are credible because now, I mean, the world is listening because you really have gained trust globally. So I think that even a few years ago, this was unthinkable, but now the youth has a role because it has a voice. So thank you, Kevin, and thank you for representing that movement.
Thank you both very much. And again, I do hope you can stay around for the offstage discussion later, because I feel like we really just scratched at the surface of these discussions. But thank you both so much for sharing your time with us. We're going to move to the third out of three discussions now, where I'm really happy to welcome to the stage Christian Schwarzer, one of the founders of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, as we all know, the official youth constituency of the CBD, who's really dedicated most of his life towards the environmental issues. Thank you for joining us, Christian. We're also welcoming to the stage Derek Mugisha, who works with Earth Day.org as the regional director in Africa, also chapter coordinator at Gibbon Uganda. He's based in Uganda and working on rallying stakeholders to make just and sustainable investments for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework worldwide. Thank you very much for joining us, Derek. Then we're also looking forward to welcoming Julia Jackson to the stage. Hi, Julia. Julia is a passionate climate activist who's committed to identifying and scaling game-changing solutions in the climate crisis. Julia founded an organization called Grounded, focusing on advancing those solutions and supporting solutionists, so change makers working on the front line of environmental change, and more recently also co-founded the Keystone Species Alliance. Thank you very much for joining us, Julia. And then last but not least, also welcoming Carl Burkhardt to the stage. Carl is the co-founder and deputy director of One Earth, and formerly the director of media, science and technology at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. One Earth supports academic institutions and NGOs working on the cutting edge of climate and energy science, biodiversity mapping, and sustainable agriculture. Thank you very much for joining us. We only have 3 microphones, so I'll have to ask you to share it. Thank you. Well, fantastic speakers. Thank you so much. I'd be really curious to hear from each of you. We heard about challenges, we heard about solutions, had some really interesting dialogues. Based on your experience and what we've heard so far, how can we create a new culture of partnership and trust between funding providers and youth recipients? How can we really work on moving from funders and recipients basically to partnerships? If it's all right, I'll start with you, Christian.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for all of you to join us here for this event. I'm incredibly excited that we can finally have a discussion about this very key topic, because if we really want to achieve the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, it will require a mobilization of all parts of society. This is no longer just a challenge for governments. This is something that we can only do if all of us are working together, if young people are an integral part of this. And this is why we as Gibbon are fighting so hard to integrate intergenerational equity and youth rights into this framework that we're discussing here. But the truth is, the current biodiversity finance system is just not set up for youth. It is set up for the big organizations. It is set up, and I say this with all respect, for the WWFs, the BirdLifes, the IUCNs of the world. Because the structural requirements that the system brings with itself can hardly be fulfilled by youth organizations. The requirements that are needed in order to access funding in terms of the legal structure, the staff structure, this is just not what grassroots movements can deliver. I've been working on establishing giving together with other people here, together with Melina, Sweidan, and others for the last 12 years. And we have seen how easy it is to bring change and how little resources it actually requires. But there is one major resource that is at the core of it, and that is trust. Trust is really what makes everything going. If you have a funder that is well-meaning, but there is no trust, then it's not going to work out. So the success of Gibbon really relies on the fact that we always identified a few champions in funding organizations that said, okay, let's forget for a moment about all the structures. Let's think about what is it that we want to achieve? What is the impact that we want to have at the end of the day? And that is something that rarely happens when you discuss with a funder. They usually approach it from the question, I have this and that program, it is designed in that way, and if you use this and this language and this term, and if you link up with this and this strategy, maybe we can do something together, but maybe you also have to provide 50% of the funding. And core costs, no, sorry, this is not possible because we don't finance anything long term. That is very often what happens, and this is exactly what we have to change. And I'm very happy that a lot of the people on the panel before pointed exactly to this. If you want to see what is possible, if we think about this from an impact point of view, go down, check out our exhibition, where you can really see what all our chapters, all our network have achieved with remarkably little amounts of funding. But now we have to change the game. What we want to achieve is something that requires much more than what we have done in the last 10 years. So the reason for the side event is really to discuss how we can provide the resources that create transformative change. And for this, we have to start thinking not in terms of 1 6-month project here, 1 6-month project there. We have to think long-term. Because what I'm seeing among young people is that there is no lack of willpower, no lack of determination to do projects, to really engage with biodiversity. There is a lack of perspective. I see a lot of amazing activists. You have all seen the pictures of the millions of young people that went on the street as part of Fridays for Future. And on the one hand, it makes me super happy to see this. On the other hand, I wonder what is going to happen in a couple of months, in a couple of years, when these people realize that change just takes time. What perspective can we give them? And that is exactly what we're trying to do with Gibbon, to build long-term structures for young people to engage in. Yes, protest on the street is important, but especially to transform this into concrete projects, this is really important. And this is my final point. I think we also need to have a discussion on how can youth be fairly compensated for all the work, all the many hours that they are investing into it. Because if we're just expecting young people to do all of this for free, then you're going to see after a couple of years, they will just look for something else that pays the rent. And these are the very, very real challenges, especially for youth in the Global South, that we have to tackle. Sorry for this long comment.
Nothing to say sorry for, Christian. I think it's important to hear those messages. And, well, as you know, I used and still am somewhat part of your network, so I can understand those frustrations from the work in Europe as well. Derek, I'd be really curious to hear what do you see has to change? How can we create these more trust-based youth-led funding relationships?
Yeah, I would start by saying I remember last year we had one with the GEF. We had an advisory which we really participated in, and I don't know if you guys hear me?
Oh, can you see it?
Hello? Yeah, okay. I remember we did an advisory about how youth want. I don't know how far that has gone, but I'm just reminding Jeff, for example, that promise has still yet to come into context. So we want to fulfill promises. So that's what I'll begin with. There are no offenses, just reminding. Because we remember saying maybe a youth fund is important at this point. We can't have the same requirements like all these top NGOs that have been there for 50 years. Youth engagement is new, quite new. So many funders are also still trying to know how to work with youth. I would say we are not the same like those ones. We are a very organized group that we just need to trust. People have talked about trust and all of these kind of things. But for me, most importantly, my first request would be, and that's why we are going to, why we go forward, is all funders should also have a youth engagement office. That's how you understand what we do. Because you want to fund us, but you don't understand us. That's the actual thing. Unless you designate a focal point within your structures that really understands our issues, funding will not be hard. We have the ideas. Our pavilion has lots of things we have done. We have success stories. So let's fund, you put the structures, you also have the structures, and let's move forward. The other one is there's a lot of money that goes through selected groups, you know? So I think we should break that as well. You know, there's a lot of money that goes to like agencies, you know, sometimes. So I think if we break that and then it make it easier for us to access funding, because really we have worked hard to raise money. It's really hard to get money when you're a young organization, a youth organization. But what we are saying is, let's try to break this language. Here, big, I don't know, here, agencies, like it scares sometimes, you know. And then the other thing is, let's make a plan together. You know, that's how we can implement the post-2020. Like we're talking about right holders, you know. We are all partners in the vision. But the only way you can make this right is if you work with us. So as you're doing your strategic plans, invite youth to tell you how these plans could be. Because I always hear replenishment programs, you know, there's a donor trying to do a strategic plan, and you don't consult youth. So I wonder what exactly you'll find if you have not put our ideas into context. And I think lastly, because people talked about requirements, I didn't want to go back to requirements, but these requirements are really huge for most of these youth organizations. And yet we have the vision, we have the plans, we have all these kind of ideas we want to be. So if donors are really serious about, you know, halting biodiversity loss, you know, it's high time you make those requirements for youth organizations. I think, try to know what can we bring, like, because now Gibbon is like 10 years, we are celebrating 10 years. So you can see in your 10 years, what have you been to do? Maybe you can try to ask some accountability. We can provide that. But also if you try to at least give us requirements that you know we are capable of providing. Like you have had audit reports, Kevin talked about audit reports. These are really even expensive things to finance. You need an auditor, you're going to pay them a lot of money, which money you do not have. You get it? So I think it's the time that we need to understand the structure, how youth engagement is. And my request is very simple. Designate a youth focal point within your agencies. That's how they will bring our ideas, because they understand the space. And those will be our contact points. Because sometimes if we go into the structure, meeting the top management is really, really hard. But if we have someone we can work with, we shall not come back here and say, you know, funding is a bit hard to get. At least let's report about the monitoring frameworks, putting them in place. But also my advice would be, as financing is being made available for youth engagement, let's put monitoring structures that are favorable, you know, that speak to the ground. Let's not put hard things in terms of monitoring, you know, put hard indicators to show the impact. Impact can't be there in like 6 months, 3 months. It has to be a long term. That's why the post-2020 talks about the vision of 2050. So let's move the journey together, and I'm happy to share more with donors on how it is and how easy it can be to finance youth-led solutions. It has happened, and it can continue to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Derek. Especially, I love that you just pointed some of these very tangible things out that funders can do to really move towards the right direction. Thank you, Derek. Julia, the same question for you from your perspective and your experience. How can we move towards this more of a partnership model of working together with youth?
Yeah, I really think that we need to scale up philanthropic giving to climate in general. Less than 2% of all giving goes to the environment. Grounded, my organization supports several youth-led organizations. We also like to support Indigenous youth and communities on the ground and elders that are going to be passing that knowledge down to Indigenous youth. I think a lot of youth that we work with feel really burnt out. They feel a huge sense of urgency that we're in a massive crisis and that older generations have failed them. I'm kind of in this like awkward in between stage where I'm also I'm like a millennial, and I feel like my future's screwed as well. I'm 34, and I'm like, I'm not going to have kids because they're not going to have a planet. But I worry very deeply about my nephews and my niece, who are all under the ages of 7. And I think that we are also in a moral crisis, and we all need to step up significantly if we want to save life on Earth. We're basically in the 6th mass extinction, and we're heading towards the extinction of humanity unless we scale up climate philanthropy and also climate solutions. I do think that, you know, it is really scary where we're heading with 422 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere and counting, but what leaves me with optimism is Mother Earth is incredibly resilient, and I think youth are more and more wanting solutions. They want government officials to act and the private sector to act, but recognize that they aren't acting with the speed that we need to get out of this crisis. And so forming partnerships with youth-led organizations that are volunteering to plant mangroves and around the world doing fabulous things to restore ecosystems and also safeguard ecosystems. I think scaling up the work on the ground with youth-led volunteer organizations that I tend to like youth-led organizations that are really particularly related to biodiversity loss and protecting and stewarding our Earth's biosphere. And I think we need to scale financing to those, not just with youth, but literally all communities safeguarding our biosphere if we want to make it out alive, and building strategic partnerships, but also partnerships of trust. A lot of indigenous communities won't work with you unless you build that deep trust. And I think that's critically important, that we build trust and head towards a livable future. And I think youth will lead the way, and they're hungry for solutions. They're sick and tired of these conferences. They're sick and tired of our Earth dying. They're sick and tired of this being the 15th Conference of Parties on Convention on Biological Diversity, and they want to see action, and we need action immediately.
Thank you, Julia, for your marks, but also this call for action for funders to really step up their game and contribute to the solution. It's ridiculous that there's not more philanthropic funding to environmental causes, and then within that small percentage, the percentage that find its way really to youth-led organizations is just a fraction, like Archana mentioned at the beginning, based on the research they've done. So, yeah, we really need to, and funders need to talk to more funders and tell each other to work more on this and step up their game. I just feel like I'm nodding all the time. I might have a sore neck afterwards. We're running a little bit over time, but it would be such a shame not to hear from you, Carl, as well. So I know you've been active in this space for very long as well, so, and have a lot of experience and perspectives on how to move towards really more support to youth as well. So what messages would you like to share?
Yeah, well, this is going to date me. I'm clearly the old guy on the panel. But have you ever the Show Me the Money, this commercial? I mean, I think that's the issue we've been tackling in philanthropy. We have a long history in working with philanthropic donors. We've moved over 110 million. We've tried to solve this problem that 75% of that money, that tiny 2%, only 25% of it makes it to the global south, where all the action is. And of that, only a tiny part of that makes it to women. And of that, only a teeny, teeny, tiny part makes it to youth. So one of the things we've been really working on is trying to do direct funding to youth. So we started, several years ago, we started a youth fellowship program. And that was with a partner called Carbon Tracker, so that we have a climate background as well. And I think you're starting to see a lot of climate folks coming in. And so it's a direct, very no reporting. We just give them a basic annual stipend for them to pursue the work they want to do. And we've had 15 so far. A lot of them are young journalists or from scientific background working, coming right out of college, sometimes right out of high school. And they're just great writers, so we've awarded them to give them a year, and often we can extend that a year. We just expanded that to a youth leader program, which is unrestricted money for a year plus travel. So they don't have to worry about sleeping on a floor to go to a climate conference or whatever, or a biodiversity conference. They can have travel and their basic needs taken care of. And this next year, we're going to have each of them nominate somebody they think deserves the fellowship. So our idea is to have it grassroots nomination. So it takes all this vetting. We're the smart, fancy donors with our, spreadsheets. We just let the youth, they know the network, they see the people, right, they work with them closely, so they're the best position to recommend who gets the funding. And then the year from that, we're hoping to create a platform to really scale youth philanthropy. So basically, we'd have a tender of money pooled to allow youth grant makers to start nominating projects that they think need funding. And so that's some of the stuff we're starting. What I've been trying to get, also no one's haven't talked about it yet, but getting youth on boards. And this is a structural problem. You made me think of it with your provocation. I actually, with my small board, which is only, we're nine, I was like, we have to have a young person on this board. Like, where our mission is to save the planet, and we're not going to be here, in 20 years. So we need youth on our board now, and they have to be paid because they're young. They can't volunteer for a board position. And we have a rule that doesn't allow us to pay board members. So I was like, we have to fix this. Like, we have to pay a youth. We can't have a youth board member that's unpaid, but for the other board donors. So there's structural problems we have to work through. And anyway, I'm glad. I loved everything you said. And I'm also so psyched to be on the panel with Gibbon, because you guys are, like, to me, one of, like, the bright lights in the sky. Like, I wish, I hope it grows and scales.
Thanks, Carl, for those remarks. And, well, first of all, encouraging to hear that there's a lot that's happening. I do find it really exciting that more and more climate-funded, people that tend to be more focused on climate, make the connection more and more with biodiversity as well. I think it's a fantastic trend, and we should incentivize that from happening more and more. And yeah, we have the same problem in the UK as well. Board members can be paid, and I agree, you can't expect someone that's at the beginning of their career to just sacrifice their free time. But then in general also, I think Julia mentioned, a lot of young people are burned out because they have work, aren't paid for much, so then often have to find another job to find money so that they can continue in their volunteering. And we're not building that resilient movement that we need to have. So I'm really sorry we're already over time, but I was wondering if we could just go to I think there's a second slide. We knew that we wouldn't be able to talk about everything, so if you'd like to continue the conversation, also for the funders in the room, if you can scan this, or I can send you the information afterwards. We'd love to organize a follow-up session, probably virtual, in the new year, just so that we can continue the conversation and stay in touch, learn from each other, listen to each other, and work towards building resilient, well-funded youth movements, funding that's, you mentioned, unrestricted, long-term, flexible, all the things we need to have. So I wanted to thank you very much, everyone that joined the panel today. Thank you so much. Thank you also to the GEF for hosting us here, and to everybody for joining the audience as well. And we can head over, get some coffee, tea, water, and continue the discussion. Thank you very much.